The smoke rose from the hillside every morning, thin and gray against the winter sky of Montana Territory. There was no cabin, no soddy, no dugout that anyone could see, just smoke rising from the frozen grass like the breath of the earth itself. Town leader Silas Crawford had searched that hillside 3 times. He had walked every inch of it with a dozen men on horseback, looking for the structure that had to be there, looking for the 2 children who had to be hiding somewhere. He found nothing but snow and dead grass and that thin wisp of smoke that seemed to come from nowhere at all. The Lindgren children are dead, he told the gathering at his general store in December of 1884. Froze out there somewhere. The smoke must be some kind of natural phenomenon, gas escaping from the ground. Those children are gone. But Solveig Lindgren was not gone. She was 15 feet below Silas Crawford's boots, lying in her bed of straw and buffalo hide, listening to him walk across her roof. Her brother Stellan lay beside her, one hand pressed against the mouth of their wolf dog Fenrir to keep him from growling. They could hear every word the men spoke above them. They could feel the vibration of hooves through the packed earth ceiling. Inside the dugout, the temperature held steady at 54 degrees. Outside, the January wind drove the mercury down to 35 below zero. The men searching for them were losing feeling in their fingers and toes. Solveig was comfortable enough to work in her cotton dress. She was 17 years old. Her brother was 15, and when the Great Blizzard came in March of 1885, the blizzard that would kill 27 souls across the territory, they would save every single person who had laughed at the smoke from nowhere. The story of how they came to live inside the earth began 5 months earlier, in September of 1884, with the death of their father. Gustav Lindgren had been a good man, a careful man, a man who had brought his children from Sweden when Solveig was 8 years old and raised them on the Montana prairie with all the skills they would need to survive. He had taught them to read the weather in the color of the sky. He taught them to find water by watching where the animals gathered at dusk. He taught them that the old ways of their homeland carried wisdom that this new country had forgotten. He had also been a man with poor judgment in women. His second wife, Harriet, had seemed kind enough before the wedding. She smiled at the children and brought them sweets from town. She praised Solveig's cooking and Stellan's woodwork. She made Gustav believe that his children would have a mother again after 5 years without one. Gustav never saw what his children saw. The way Harriet's smile disappeared the moment he turned away. The way her voice changed when she spoke to them alone. The way she looked at the homestead not as a home, but as property, calculating its value with every glance. On the morning of September 15th, Gustav's horse spooked at a rattlesnake on the trail back from town. The animal reared and threw him against a boulder. He lived for 3 days unconscious while Harriet sat by his bedside, and Solveig tried every remedy her grandmother had taught her. Nothing worked. Gustav Lindgren died on September 18th without ever waking to say goodbye to his children. They buried him on the hill overlooking the homestead, next to the grave of their mother who had died on the crossing from Sweden. Solveig was numb with grief. Stellan had not spoken a word since watching them lower the coffin into the ground. Fenrir lay on the fresh dirt and would not move, not even to eat. 3 days after the funeral, Harriet revealed what she truly was. Solveig was in the kitchen preparing the evening meal when her stepmother appeared in the doorway. There was no pretense of kindness in her face now, no smile, just cold calculation and something that looked almost like triumph. "This homestead is mine now." Harriet's voice was flat and certain. "The law says a widow inherits. You are not my children. You are not my responsibility. Get out." Solveig felt the words like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the table to keep herself standing. "This land belonged to our grandfather." She kept her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Father inherited it from him. There are papers." Harriet smiled then, and the smile was terrible. Your father was unconscious for 3 days before he died. 3 days is a long time, long enough for a dying man to sign a new will, long enough for that will to be witnessed by Cornelius Webb, who happens to be a lawyer and who happens to owe me certain favors. She reached into her pocket and produced a document covered in legal language. At the bottom was a signature that might have been Gustav's, though it trembled across the page like the hand of a man barely clinging to life. Solveig stared at the paper. Her father had been unconscious. She had sat beside him for those 3 days, had held his hand, had watched his chest rise and fall without waking. He had not signed anything. But who would believe her? A 17-year-old Swedish immigrant girl against a respectable widow and a licensed attorney. That is a forgery. Solveig spoke quietly, but there was steel beneath the words. Harriet's hand moved faster than thought. The slap cracked across Solveig's cheek and sent her stumbling against the stove. Before she could recover, Harriet crossed to where Stellan stood frozen in the doorway and shoved him hard. The boy fell backward off the porch steps and landed in the dirt. Fenrir lunged forward with teeth bared, placing himself between the children and the woman who had hurt them. His growl was low and dangerous, the sound of a wolf protecting its pack. Harriet picked up a stone from beside the porch. "Take that mongrel and get off my property. Both of you, before sundown, or I will send for the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing." She threw the stone. It struck Fenrir's shoulder and he yelped but did not retreat. He stood his ground until Solveig called him to her side. "Come." She helped her brother to his feet, tasting blood where she had bitten her tongue. "We are leaving." They walked away from the homestead with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Solveig did not look back. She could not bear to see the home where she had grown up, the garden her mother had planted, the workshop where her father had taught Stellan to build. All of it stolen by a woman they had tried so hard to welcome into their family. Stellan walked beside her in silence, his face blank with shock. Fenrir padded between them, occasionally looking back over his shoulder as if expecting Gustav to call them home. But Gustav was dead. Their home was gone, and the town of Ridgewood watched them walk away without a single voice raised in their defense. I need to pause here and ask you something important. Have you ever been judged by someone who did not know your story? Have you ever been dismissed because of how you looked, where you came from, or what you did not have? Tell me in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from today, and tell me if Solveig's story reminds you of your own. Because what happens next will show you exactly what those judgments were worth. The people of Ridgewood had watched the Lindgren family for 3 years. They had seen Gustav build his homestead with his own hands, seen his children work beside him from dawn until dark. They had traded with him at the general store and nodded to him at Sunday services. Some had even called him friend. Now they watched his children walk into town with nothing, and not one of them offered help. Solveig went first to the church. The whitewashed building sat at the center of town, its steeple pointing toward a heaven that seemed very far away. Inside, Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore was preparing his sermon for the coming Sunday. "Please." Solveig stood in the doorway, her cheek still red from Harriet's slap. "Our stepmother has cast us out. We have nowhere to go. Perhaps the church could shelter us until we find work." The Reverend was a tall man with a long face and eyes that seemed to look past whoever stood before him. He studied Solveig for a long moment, then shook his head. "A dutiful daughter does not quarrel with her mother. Perhaps this is a lesson the Lord wishes you to learn. Return to your stepmother and submit to her authority as Scripture commands. She is not our mother." Stellan's voice was hoarse from disuse, but anger had broken through his silence. "She stole our home. She forged our father's signature." Reverend Whitmore's expression hardened. "I will not shelter children who speak ill of their elders. You may leave now." From the church, they went to the general store. Silas Crawford was the town leader, the man everyone looked to when decisions needed to be made. Surely he would see justice done. But Silas only laughed when Solveig explained their situation. He laughed loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. Martha Prescott buying flour, Thaddeus Holloway examining axe handles, the cluster of young men loitering near the tobacco, including Jedediah Tanner with his mean eyes and his father's money. Those Swedish children will not survive until November. Silas announced it to the room like a verdict. Look at them. Skinny as fence posts. This is what happens when you do not raise children properly. A decent girl would have made herself useful to her stepmother. Solveig felt her face flush with shame and rage, but she kept her voice steady. We only need shelter for a few days. We can work. We will earn our keep. Silas Crawford leaned across his counter, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath. I do not shelter vagrants, and I do not hire Swedish brats who cannot keep their own family from throwing them out. Now get out of my store before I have Jedediah here escort you out. Jedediah Tanner grinned at the suggestion, cracking his knuckles. Solveig did not give him the satisfaction. She took her brother's hand and walked out with her head held high, Fenrir growling low at her side. Outside, Martha Prescott was already spreading the word to two women on the boardwalk. The Lindgren children had been thrown out by their stepmother. Poor things, but perhaps they did something to deserve it. You know how those Swedish families are. Strange customs. It is no wonder the girl cannot find anyone to take her in. By sundown, every door in Ridgewood was closed to them. 6 miles east of town, in a cabin so small it was barely more than a shed, an old man sat beside his fire and waited. Magnus Lindgren was 74 years old. His hands were twisted with arthritis, his lungs scarred from decades in the Swedish iron mines, his body worn down by a life of labor that had started before he could read. He had come to America 30 years ago, following his son Gustav, hoping to find a place where the air was clean and the land was free. He had helped Gustav build the first homestead and taught him everything about surviving in country that did not forgive mistakes. Then they had quarreled, as fathers and sons sometimes do, and Magnus moved to his own small cabin to live out his remaining years alone. The quarrel had been about the old ways. Gustav wanted to build like the Americans, with frame houses and shingled roofs and wood stoves that devoured fuel faster than a man could cut it. Magnus wanted to build as their ancestors had, with thick walls and earthen roofs and the deep knowledge of how to work with the land instead of against it. Gustav had called him old-fashioned. Magnus had called his son a fool. Neither apologized before Gustav died. Now Magnus sat by his fire and listened to the wind and thought about his grandchildren walking through the September darkness with nowhere to go. He had heard about Harriet. He had heard about the forged will. He had wanted to come to town and speak for them, but his legs would barely carry him to the woodpile anymore. So he waited. He prayed. And when he heard Fenrir's bark in the darkness outside his door, he closed his eyes and thanked whatever gods were listening that his grandchildren were smarter than their father had been. The door opened. Solveig stood in the entrance with Stellan beside her, both shivering, both exhausted, both carrying the weight of everything they had lost. Grandfather. Solveig's voice nearly broke. We have nowhere else to go. Magnus rose from his chair, joints protesting, and opened his arms. Then come in. Come in and let me tell you how we are going to survive. That first night in Magnus's cabin, the three of them sat around the small fire while the old man talked, and Solveig listened with growing wonder. There is a land. Magnus leaned forward, his eyes bright in the firelight. 30 acres on the eastern slope of Ridgewood Hill. Your father never bothered to file the claim because he thought it was worthless. Just grass and hillside, he said. But I know that hill. I know what it can give to someone who understands how to ask. Harriet does not know about this land. No one knows except me. And now you. He reached out and took his granddaughter's hand. We are going to build you a home there. A home that no one can find. A home that no one can take away. How can we build a home that no one can find? Stellan spoke for the first time since leaving the homestead. Magnus smiled, And in that smile was all the wisdom of the old country, all the knowledge passed down through generations of people who had survived winters that would kill the unprepared. In Sweden, we called it jordkällare, a house built into the earth. Our ancestors learned this from the land itself. He picked up a stick and began drawing in the ashes. The earth stays the same temperature all year, 54 degrees give or take. Does not matter if it is 40 below outside. The earth remembers summer, and it keeps that warmth until summer comes again. He sketched the shape of a hillside with a chamber carved into it. We dig into the south face of the hill, where the winter sun will warm the entrance. The angle must be precise, 15 degrees to catch the low December sun. We go down 15 feet to reach the stable temperature zone. Above that depth, the ground freezes and thaws with the seasons. Below it, the earth holds steady all year round. And the smoke? Solveig asked. If we have a fire, there will be smoke. Magnus nodded approvingly. The chimney pipe will be only 3 inches wide, much smaller than any stovepipe in town. A narrow pipe creates a stronger draft, pulls the smoke up and out more efficiently, and it makes the smoke nearly invisible, a thin gray thread that looks like mist or steam. He met her eyes. They will search for you. They will walk right over your roof, and they will never find you. They began in October, when the prairie grass was turning gold and the first frost silvered the mornings. The site Magnus had chosen was perfect. A fold in the hillside created a natural blind from every direction. Anyone approaching from town would see nothing but grass and rock. Anyone riding along the ridge above would see only the slope falling away toward the creek. The entrance would face south, catching the low winter sun, protected from the north wind by the bulk of the hill. Solveig marked out the dimensions with wooden stakes, following the measurements Magnus had calculated. 14 feet wide, 22 feet deep, ceiling 7 feet high when completed. The walls would be 3 feet thick, packed earth that would never burn and never blow away. The entrance faced due south at 15 degrees to catch the winter sun. Magnus had calculated precisely. At this latitude in December, the sun would shine directly into the entrance for 2 hours each day, warming the space without any fuel at all. The chimney pipe was only 3 inches in diameter. A narrow pipe created stronger draft, pulling smoke up efficiently, making it nearly invisible against the sky. They would dig down 15 feet to reach the stable temperature zone. Above that depth, ground froze and thawed with the seasons. Below it, the earth held steady at 54 degrees year-round, a gift from the planet itself. Stellan swung the pickaxe. Day after day, hour after hour, he broke through the hard-packed earth, while Solveig hauled the dirt away in a wooden sled that Fenrir helped pull. The work was brutal. Stellan's hands blistered and bled, and blistered again, until calluses formed hard as horn. Solveig's shoulders ached so badly that some nights she could not sleep, but they did not stop. Magnus supervised from a chair they carried to the site each morning. His body was too broken to help with digging, but his mind was sharp as ever. He told them how to angle the entrance so water would drain away during spring thaw. He showed them how to cut sod blocks that would hold together. He explained how to build a roof from timber and earth that would support a man's weight. The old ways. He said it again and again. Our ancestors survived winters that would kill everyone in this soft American town. They survived because they understood that you do not fight the earth. You work with it. You let it protect you. By the end of October, they had excavated the main chamber. The walls of packed earth rose around them, cool and solid and somehow reassuring. Stellan had begun to smile again, a rare expression that appeared when he stepped back to look at what they had built. But they were not invisible yet, and the people of Ridgewood had begun to notice. Thaddeus Holloway was the first to come investigating. He was the town's carpenter and builder, a man who had constructed half the structures in Ridgewood and considered himself an expert on everything related to construction. When Martha Prescott told him that the Lindgren children had been seen digging into a hillside east of town, he saddled his horse and rode out to see for himself. He found the disturbed earth easily enough. Fresh dirt piled in mounds, grass torn up in patches, signs of recent activity that even a child could read. But he did not find the children. Magnus had anticipated visitors. The entrance was hidden behind a fold in the rock formation, accessible only by a narrow path that looked like a natural drainage channel. From every other angle, there was nothing to see but hillside and stone. Thaddeus walked within 10 feet of the entrance without noticing it. He stood directly above the main chamber, the roof not yet completed but covered with brush and canvas that blended with the surrounding grass. He searched for nearly an hour, growing more frustrated with each passing minute. Finally, he rode back to town. "Those children are digging their own graves," he announced it at the general store that evening. "Building some kind of hole in the ground like animals. It will collapse before Christmas. They will be buried alive. Good riddance." Jedediah Tanner laughed. "Saves us the trouble of running them off ourselves." Silas Crawford stroked his beard. "The girl has spirit. I will give her that. But spirit does not keep you warm when the temperature drops. Those children are dead already. They just do not know it yet." The searchers came on the last day of October. 12 men on horseback, led by Silas Crawford himself, riding out with the stated purpose of finding the Lindgren children and bringing them back to town for their own safety. Solveig heard them coming. The sound of hooves carried clearly through the earth, vibrating through the walls like a warning drum. She and Stellan pressed themselves against the packed dirt, barely breathing, while Fenrir lay between them with ears flat against his skull. Above them, the men rode in circles. They dismounted and walked the hillside, calling out, looking for any sign of habitation. Several times their footsteps passed directly over the roof, so close that Solveig could hear the creak of leather and jingle of spurs. They must be somewhere. One man's voice was muffled by the earth between them. "Look at all this fresh dirt. Prairie dogs," another voice suggested, "or badgers. No structure could be hidden here." That was Thaddeus Holloway, confident as always. "I told you, they probably died somewhere out on the prairie." The search continued for nearly 2 hours. The men walked within arm's reach of the hidden entrance. They stood on the roof and argued about where to look next. They never saw a thing. Finally, Silas Crawford called a halt. "The children are gone. Dead or run off, it does not matter. We have wasted enough time on Swedish orphans who were too foolish to accept help when it was offered." No one mentioned that no help had actually been offered. They mounted their horses and rode back to town, and Solveig allowed herself to breathe again. That night, Magnus came to inspect their progress. He walked through the hidden entrance, stood in the center of the main chamber, and his weathered face broke into a smile. "You have become everything I hoped you could be. This is better than anything I ever built. Warmer, tighter, more hidden. They will never find you here." Solveig felt tears prick at her eyes. "They walked right over us. They could not see a thing." "No, but someday they may need to." Magnus's face grew serious. "Winter is not over yet, child. I have seen the signs. There is a storm coming. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but soon. The kind of storm that kills everything it touches. When it comes, this place will be the only shelter for miles. If you have made it this far, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. Not because I am asking, but because you need to see what happens next. Everything you think you know about who was prepared for the winter of 1885 is about to change. Everything you believe about strength and weakness, about wisdom and foolishness, is about to be tested. Stay with me. Through November and December, life in the dugout settled into a rhythm. Solveig rose before dawn each day to tend the stove and prepare breakfast. Stellan hunted when the weather allowed, bringing back rabbits and prairie chickens that they smoked and stored in the root cellar, dug even deeper than their main room. Fenrir had grown into his full size now, a magnificent animal with the gray coat of his wolf ancestors and the loyal heart of the dog his mother had been. The smoke rose from the hillside every morning, thin, gray, visible for miles. The smoke from nowhere became a joke in Ridgewood, a mystery that people talked about at the general store and laughed about in the saloon. Maybe it is a ghost, someone suggested. Maybe the earth itself is burning, said another. Maybe Silas Crawford cannot find his own backside with both hands, said a third, and everyone laughed except Silas, who grew more furious with every failed search. He knew those children were out there. He knew they were surviving somehow, and part of him, a part he would never admit, hated them for it, hated them for defying what he had declared, for refusing to die when he had pronounced them dead, for proving him wrong in front of the entire town. The visitor came on a Thursday in the middle of December. Solveig was outside the entrance, gathering firewood from the cache hidden among the rocks, when she heard footsteps crunching through the snow. She dropped the wood and pressed against the stone, one hand reaching for the knife at her belt. A figure appeared around the fold in the hillside, young, male, wearing the good wool coat of someone with money. For a terrible moment, she thought it was Jedediah Tanner come to make trouble. Then she recognized the face, Tobias Whitmore, the Reverend's son. He stopped when he saw her, breath clouding in the cold air. His expression was not hostile, not mocking, just curious and perhaps a little sad. "I knew you were here," he spoke quietly. "I have known for weeks. I followed the smoke one morning when the wind was still." Solveig's hand tightened on her knife. "Are you going to tell them?" Tobias was silent for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "I should. My father would want me to. Silas Crawford would reward me. Everyone would say I did the right thing. But I have watched you, both of you. I have seen how hard you work, how much you have built with nothing but your own hands. And I have listened to my father preach about Christian charity every Sunday, while refusing to lift a finger to help 2 orphan children." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Glass. For windows. I thought you might need it for light." Solveig stared at the bundle, then at the young man who had brought it. "Why? Why would you help us?" Tobias's jaw tightened. "Because my mother died 3 winters ago, pneumonia. She was sick for 2 weeks, and every day my father said he would stay with her, and every day he left to preach or to counsel or to do anything except sit with his dying wife. She died alone, calling for him, and he was not there." He met Solveig's eyes. "My father talks about God's love, but he does not know what love means. I think you do. I think that is why you built this place. Not just to survive, but to have something that cannot be taken away." Solveig felt her throat tighten. She took the bundle from his hands. "Thank you." It was not enough, but it was all she could manage. Tobias nodded. "The smoke. Every morning I see it, and I think about you down here, warm and safe while everyone else shivers. There is something almost magical about it. The smoke from nowhere." He smiled slightly. "I hope you make it through the winter." Then he was gone. Tobias became their secret ally. He came when he could, always careful not to be followed, always bringing something useful. More window glass, door hinges, sacks of flour and salt, a jar of precious honey that Solveig saved for Magnus when his cough grew worse. He never stayed long, never came inside the dugout. But his visits became a lifeline connecting them to a world that had cast them out. Old Ingeborg Svensson came too, though she was no secret. She was 78 years old, the last Swede besides Magnus still living in the territory, and she had nothing left to fear from Ridgewood. When she heard about the smoke from nowhere, she knew immediately what it meant. Jordkellera. She whispered it when she saw the entrance for the first time, tears running down her weathered cheeks. My grandfather built one just like this in Dalarna. I thought everyone had forgotten. She brought woven blankets and bear grease for waterproofing, and stories of the old country that made Magnus smile despite his worsening cough. Doc Elias Mercer came once, pretending it was just a walk to clear his head. He was the town's physician, a quiet man with kind eyes and the weariness of someone who had seen too much suffering. He examined Magnus without being asked and left medicine without accepting payment. The old man does not have long, he told Solveig quietly as he was leaving. Months, perhaps. The mining dust has filled his lungs. There is nothing I can do except ease the pain. Solveig nodded. She had known. I have been watching that smoke all winter, the doctor said. Everyone laughs about it. But whatever you have built in there, it is working. When the weather breaks, I would like to understand how. But Harriet had not forgotten her stepchildren. She had spent the winter months seething in the homestead that should have been hers alone. Every time she heard someone mention the smoke from nowhere, every time Silas Crawford complained about another failed search, her hatred grew sharper. Those children were alive. They were surviving. And somewhere on this prairie, they might be living on land that legally belonged to her. In late January, she sent word to a man named Jasper Colt. Jasper was a bounty hunter who worked the territories between Montana and the Dakotas. He had a reputation for finding people who did not want to be found. He had tracked fugitives through blizzards, across rivers, into the deepest wilderness. 2 orphaned children hiding in the hills would be easy money. He arrived in Ridgewood on the last day of January, a lean man with eyes the color of river ice. He did not announce himself. He did not ask questions at the saloon or the general store. He simply watched. For 2 weeks, Jasper observed the patterns of Ridgewood. He noted who came and went, who carried extra supplies, who rode east toward the hills when they thought no one was looking. On the 14th day, he saw Tobias Whitmore leave town with a sack of flour he had not purchased at the general store. Jasper followed at a distance, patient as a wolf tracking wounded prey. He watched Tobias disappear around a fold in the rocks on the eastern hillside. He watched the young man emerge an hour later, empty-handed. That night, Jasper reported to Harriet, "The preacher's boy is helping them. There is a hidden entrance in the rocks. I can lead you right to it." Harriet's smile was terrible. "Not yet. I want witnesses. I want the whole town to see those children dragged out of their hole. Wait for the weather to clear, then we will go together." She did not know that the weather would never clear, not the way she expected. Inside the dugout, Solveig had no idea how close the danger had come. She did not know that a bounty hunter had nearly found them, that Harriet was planning a final assault, that the net was tightening around everything she had built. But Magnus knew something was wrong. He could feel it in the way the air pressure changed, in the restless behavior of Fenrir, in the yellow tinge that sometimes appeared on the northern horizon. "Storm coming," he muttered in his sleep. "Big storm. Soon now." In early February, Magnus collapsed. Solveig found him in his cabin, lying on the floor beside his bed, too weak to rise. His lips were blue. His breathing was the terrible wet rattle she had been dreading. When she tried to lift him, he weighed almost nothing, as if his body had already begun to leave this world. She and Stellan carried him through the snow to the dugout. They made a bed for him against the warmest wall, near the stove, where the earth's constant temperature would keep him comfortable. They wrapped him in every blanket they had and fed him broth and prayed to whatever gods might be listening. For 3 days, Magnus drifted between consciousness and fever dreams. He called out names Solveig did not recognize, spoke in Swedish about mines and mountains, and a woman named Britta, who must have been his wife, dead these 40 years. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Magnus opened his eyes, clear and present for the first time since his collapse, and looked around the earthen room where his grandchildren had nursed him. "This is a good place to die." His voice was barely a whisper. "You are not going to die." Solvay said it knowing it was a lie. Magnus smiled. "Everyone dies, child. The question is whether you have built something that lasts, whether you have passed on what you know." He reached out and took her hand. "I have taught you everything. The old ways, the ways of our people. Promise me you will teach others. Promise me you will not let it be forgotten. I promise. The storm is coming." Magnus's eyes were already closing. "I can feel it. Soon now." The dugout was complete by the end of February. 14 feet wide, 22 feet deep, with walls that stayed at 54 degrees no matter what the wind did outside. Solvay had built a bed into one wall, a frame of cottonwood poles cushioned with dried grass and buffalo hides. Stellan had crafted a table and chairs from timber hauled 3 miles from the creek. Shelves lined the walls, filled with preserved vegetables, smoked rabbit, dried berries. The stove was a masterpiece of efficiency. Small iron box burning minimal fuel, smoke rising through the narrow pipe that made it nearly invisible against the winter sky. On the last day of February, Harriet made her move. She organized a party of 15 people. Silas Crawford came, eager to prove the smoke from nowhere had a source. Thaddeus Holloway came, determined to see the structure that had made a fool of him. Jedediah Tanner came because he hoped there would be violence. Cornelius Webb came because Harriet paid him. Jasper Colt led the way. They rode to the hillside following the route Jasper had memorized. The bounty hunter moved with confidence, leading them around the fold in the rocks, pointing toward where the hidden entrance had to be. They were 20 feet from the door when the sky began to change. It started as a yellow tinge on the northern horizon, a color that had no place in a winter sky. Then the wind shifted suddenly, coming from the north now, with a bite that had not been there before. The temperature began to drop. "We should go back." Doc Mercer had come along to make sure no one was hurt. "Something is not right." Silas Crawford laughed. "We are this close to finding those children, and you want to leave because of a little wind? Keep looking." They searched. They dug at the snow. They called for Solvay and Stellan to show themselves. They were so focused on their hunt that they did not notice the sky growing darker, the wind growing stronger, the temperature falling with every passing minute. Inside the dugout, Solvay heard them coming. She and Stellan pressed against the walls, barely breathing. Fenrir lay between them with hackles raised. From his bed, Magnus opened his eyes. The storm. His whisper was barely audible. "It is here." The blizzard of March 1885 came without warning, or rather with warnings that no one had heeded. At noon, the temperature was 40 degrees above zero. By 2 o'clock, it had dropped to 0. By 4, it was 20 below and falling. By nightfall, the wind was screaming across the prairie at 70 miles per hour, driving snow so thick that a man could not see his own feet. Harriet's search party scattered like leaves. Some made it back to their horses and rode blind toward town, trusting their animals to find the way. Some took shelter behind rocks and prayed. Some simply ran, and running in a blizzard with no visibility was a death sentence. Jasper Colt was found 3 days later, frozen solid in a creek bed half a mile from where they had been searching. 2 of his fingers had to be amputated, the flesh blackened by frostbite so severe that bone showed through. But the worst fate belonged to Harriet. She ran when the storm hit, ran in what she thought was the direction of town, but the wind turned her around until she had no idea which way she was facing. She called for help, but the wind swallowed her voice. She stumbled through snow already waist deep, feeling her strength failing, feeling the cold seeping into her bones. She died 30 feet from the entrance to the dugout, 30 feet from the warmth that could have saved her, 30 feet from the stepchildren she had tried to destroy. She died reaching toward a door she could not see, her last breath freezing in her lungs, her body buried by snow before she was even cold. They would not find her until March when the thaw came. She was still reaching, her frozen hands extended toward nothing. The blizzard lasted 9 days. In town, Ridgewood was dying. The buildings that had seemed so solid were no match for a storm of this magnitude. Wind found every crack, every gap. Snow piled against doors and windows until they could not be opened. Roofs groaned under weights they were never designed to bear. By the second day, 3 homes had collapsed. By the third day, the general store's roof caved in, bearing half of Silas Crawford's inventory under a mountain of snow. By the fourth day, people were burning furniture to stay warm, and livestock were dying in barns that had become tombs. By the fifth day, 17 people had died, frozen in buildings that could not keep them warm, lost in snow trying to reach a woodpile 20 feet away, crushed when roofs gave way. And on the hillside east of town, smoke continued to rise from nowhere. Silas Crawford saw the smoke on the sixth day, when the wind dropped just enough to make out shapes in the distance. He had lost everything. His store was destroyed. His home was barely standing. His certainty, the unshakable confidence that had defined him for 55 years, had crumbled like the buildings around him. He stood at his window watching that thin gray thread rise against the white sky, and he understood at last what it meant. Those children were alive. In their hole in the ground, their animal burrow, they were warm and safe while everyone else was dying. The smoke was not a mystery. It was a chimney drawing heat from a stove that burned efficiently, while his own stove devoured fuel faster than he could feed it. God help me, he whispered it to the frozen glass. I called them fools, and they were the only wise ones among us. Before we go any further, I want you to stop and think. Think about a time when you were absolutely certain you were right. When you looked at someone else's choices and knew in your bones they were making a mistake. Now think about how it felt to discover you were wrong. That is where Silas Crawford stood on the sixth day of the Great Blizzard. That is where we all stand, sooner or later. Share this moment with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to ask for help from the person you dismissed? On the 10th day, when the storm finally broke, the survivors of Ridgewood began to move. There were 33 of them. 33 people out of a town that had held nearly 100. 33 souls huddled in the few buildings that had not collapsed, sharing what little food remained, knowing they would not last another week. Silas Crawford gathered them in what remained of the church, its roof sagging dangerously. I know where we can find shelter. His voice was hoarse, his face weathered by days of cold and grief. I know where those children are hiding, the ones we said would not survive, the ones we refused to help. He paused, and in that pause was everything he had lost. We are going to go to them. We are going to ask for help. And if they turn us away, we deserve it. No one argued. They had no alternatives left. The journey was only a mile, but it took 4 hours. The snow was chest deep, requiring them to take turns breaking a path. The weak were carried by the strong. The children rode on their parents' backs. Tobias Whitmore led the way. He was the only one who knew exactly where the entrance was hidden. They rounded the fold in the rocks just as the sun began to set. And there was Solveig Lindgren, standing in the doorway of her underground home, watching them come. The moment stretched like taffy. Solveig stood in the entrance with Stellan at her shoulder, both thinner than they had been in September, but standing straight and strong. Fenrir pressed against her leg, gray coat bristling, a low growl building in his throat. Behind them, visible through the doorway, was a space that glowed with warmth and light. Silas Crawford stepped forward. His expensive coat was torn, his boots soaked through. His face bore the marks of frostbite that would scar him for life. He fell to his knees in the snow. I know you. Solveig's voice was calm, but there was something beneath the calm, something forged in months of hunger and labor and betrayal. You said we would not survive until November. You said we were living like animals. I was wrong. Silas could barely get the words out. We were all wrong. Please. There are children with us, old people. They will die if we do not find shelter. Sauvé looked past him at the crowd huddled in the snow. Martha Prescott, who had spread rumors. Thaddeus Holloway, who had called this place a grave. Jedediah Tanner, who had bet money on her death. Reverend Whitmore, who had refused sanctuary and quoted scripture about obedience. And the children. Etta Holloway, 6 years old, clinging to her father's leg with eyes too large for her pale face. The Henderson twins, barely old enough to walk. A dozen other faces, innocent of their parents' cruelty. Stellan spoke from behind her, his voice hard. Close the door. Let them die like they wanted us to die. Solveig did not move. She was remembering her grandfather's words. You can have revenge, or you can become the person your father wanted you to be. She was remembering her father, who had helped every neighbor who asked, who never turned away anyone in need. She was remembering her mother, who had died on the crossing from Sweden, whose last wish was that her daughter grow up to be kind. The silence stretched. The wind picked up, driving fresh snow against the huddled survivors. Finally, Solveig stepped back from the entrance. Come in, all of you, there is room. The dugout that everyone had laughed at held 33 people for 2 weeks. It should not have been possible. 14 feet by 22 feet was not enough space for that many bodies. There was not enough food, not enough fuel, not enough air. But it worked. Solveig organized them with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. The children were placed nearest the stove. The elderly were given the best blankets. The able-bodied took turns keeping the fire burning, fetching snow to melt for water, standing watch at the entrance. She gave them her food, the preserved vegetables, the smoked rabbit, the dried berries. She gave them her fuel, the wood she and Stellan had hauled 3 miles from the creek. She gave them her blankets, her space, her home. And in giving, she received something unexpected. The people who had mocked her began to change. It started with Etta Holloway. The little girl had not spoken since the storm began. 6 days of terror had locked her voice somewhere deep inside. On the 3rd day in the shelter, Fenrir padded over to where she sat. The great wolf dog, who had growled at every adult who entered, lowered himself beside the child and laid his head in her lap. Etta looked down at him. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then her hand slowly uncurled. Her fingers touched the gray fur. Can I pet the dog? Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the dugout, everyone heard. Her mother burst into tears. Her father turned away to hide his own. Solveig knelt beside the little girl. His name is Fenrir. He has been waiting for someone to pet him. Etta's face transformed. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the beginning of one. She stroked Fenrir's fur while his tail thumped against the packed earth floor, and something broken began to heal. On the 5th night, Silas Crawford approached Solveig, where she sat by the stove. He lowered himself to the ground, joints protesting. For a long moment he said nothing, just watched the flames dance behind the iron door. I owe you a debt I can never repay. His voice was quiet, meant for her alone. Every day I wake up in this shelter, I remember what I said about you, what I believed. He turned to look at her, eyes wet. I called you an animal. I said you were digging your own grave. I led search parties to find you and drive you out. And every time I failed, I told myself it was because you were hiding like a criminal. He shook his head. I was the one hiding behind my position, my money, my certainty that I knew better than everyone else. I looked at a 17-year-old girl building something I could not understand, and instead of asking what I might learn, I decided she must be wrong. Solveig did not answer. She waited. Your father was a good man. Silas continued. I did not know him well, but I watched him. I saw how he helped his neighbors, how he never turned anyone away. I always thought that made him weak. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. It turns out I was the soft one. When the storm came, my buildings fell and my money meant nothing, and all my certainty turned to ash. Why? Solveig finally spoke. After everything, why would you help us now? I should be asking you that question. Silas met her eyes. After everything we did, after everything we said, why did you let us in? Solveig looked at the sleeping forms around her, the children curled against their parents, the elderly wrapped in blankets, the skeptics and gossips and bullies, all vulnerable now, all dependent on her mercy. Because my father would have. Because my grandfather taught me that survival is never just about yourself. Because you are people, even if you were not very good at being people when times were easy. She turned back to the fire. And because I do not want to become like you were, I do not want bitterness to be the only thing I build. Silas bowed his head. Tears fell onto the packed earth. I do not deserve your forgiveness. No, you do not. Solveig watched the flames. But you are going to get it anyway. That is what grace means. The storm finally released its grip on the third week of March. The survivors emerged from the dugout, blinking in sudden brightness, eyes unaccustomed to the glare of sun on snow. The world outside had been transformed. Drifts rose higher than a man's head. The landscape had been sculpted into unfamiliar shapes. They walked toward town in a long line, picking through the snow, not speaking. Ridgewood was destroyed. Of the 43 buildings that had stood before the blizzard, fewer than a dozen remained intact. The general store was a ruin. The church had lost half its sanctuary. The saloon was simply gone. Bodies were discovered over the following weeks as the snow melted. 27 people had died, frozen in their homes, lost in the white, crushed under failing roofs. Among them was Harriet. They found her 30 feet from the dugout entrance. She had been so close. If she had known where to look, if she had been willing to ask, she might have lived. Solveig stood over the frozen body of her stepmother and felt nothing but emptiness. She was a person. She said it quietly to Stellan, a terrible person who did terrible things. But she was still a person. Stellan spat on the ground. She deserves to rot. Maybe. Solveig turned away. But we do not have to be the ones who wish it on her. We are almost at the end now. But I need one more moment with you. This story has been about survival, about preparation, about the knowledge that gets passed down through generations when we are wise enough to listen. But it has also been about something else. It has been about grace. Grace is what Solveig showed when she opened that door. Grace is what Silas learned when he knelt in the snow. Grace is what transforms a story of revenge into a story of redemption. Before I tell you how it ends, I want to know, what has this story taught you? Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear about the smoke from nowhere. And remember that sometimes the people who look like they are hiding are just getting ready for something you cannot see coming. In the weeks that followed, the survivors of Ridgewood began to rebuild. But they did not rebuild the way they had before. The first thing they built was a dugout. Silas Crawford organized the labor. Thaddeus Holloway contributed his expertise. Every able-bodied survivor took a turn with the shovel, cutting into a south-facing hillside just as Solveig and Stellan had done. Teach us. Silas said it standing before Solveig, hat in his hands. Teach us what your grandfather taught you. We will never be caught unprepared again. So she taught them. She showed them how to choose a site where winter sun would warm the entrance. She explained how deep to dig to reach a stable temperature. She demonstrated proper drainage angles, wall thickness, roof construction. By the end of summer, 5 dugouts had been completed in the hills around Ridgewood. By the following winter, there were a dozen. The technique spread to neighboring towns, carried by survivors who told the story of the smoke from nowhere. Magnus Lindgren died on a soft April evening when the snow had melted and the first green shoots were pushing through the prairie grass. He had held on through the storm, through the weeks of recovery, through the vindication of everything he had taught. He lived long enough to see his grandchildren honored, his knowledge valued. The old ways take root in this new country. He died in the dugout, in the bed against the warm wall, with Solveig holding one hand and Stellan holding the other. Fenrir lay at his feet, keeping watch one last time. "You have become everything I hoped you could be." Magnus's voice was barely audible. "Everything your mother prayed for when she died on that ship. Everything this family was meant to be." Solveig felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I promise. I will teach everyone who wants to learn." Magnus smiled, his eyes closed. Britta. He murmured a name 40 years gone. "I am coming." His breathing slowed, stopped. One final rattling gasp, then silence. They buried him on the hillside next to the dugout, where the smoke still rose each morning. The headstone was carved by Stellan, Magnus Lindgren. "He taught us how to disappear. We learned how to survive." 5 years after the Great Blizzard, Solveig Lindgren married Tobias Whitmore in a ceremony held at the entrance to her dugout. It was not a traditional wedding. The bride wore a simple dress she had sewn herself. The groom stood beside her in work clothes, his hands calloused from years of building underground shelters. Reverend Whitmore performed the ceremony. He had changed since the blizzard, softened by the humility that near death brings. He no longer preached about submission. Instead, he spoke of grace, of second chances, of love growing in unexpected soil. Solveig and Tobias built their home on the same hillside where she had survived that first terrible winter. A proper house now, with thick walls and steep roof designed to shed snow. They built a second dugout beside it, a shelter that could hold 50 people if another storm came. They had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. All of them learned the old ways before they learned to read. Stellan married too. A quiet girl from a Norwegian family 3 counties over, someone who understood why he spent so much time underground. He became a builder, not of houses, but of refugees. He traveled throughout the territory, teaching the techniques Magnus had taught, constructing dugouts for anyone who asked. He never charged. He said he was paying back a debt that could never be fully repaid. Silas Crawford lived another 22 years after the blizzard. He never returned to his position as town leader, never rebuilt his store. Instead, he became something no one who knew him before would have predicted: a teacher. He spent the rest of his life helping newcomers understand what they were facing. He told them about the storm of '85. He took them to see Solveig's dugout, still standing, still holding its temperature. He explained that the old ways carried wisdom the new ways had forgotten. When he died peacefully in his sleep at 77, Solveig spoke at his funeral. For most of his life, he measured worth by wealth and judged people by appearances. He dismissed what he did not understand and mocked what he could not control. She paused, looking at the mourners. But he learned. When the storm came, he learned. And he spent the rest of his life making sure others would not have to learn the way he did. She placed a hand on his coffin. That is redemption, not perfection, not erasing what came before. Just the willingness to keep trying, to keep learning, to keep building even after everything falls down. Fenrir lived to be 14 years old. In his final years, he could no longer climb the hillside to the dugout. His legs had grown weak, his eyes cloudy, his hearing almost gone. But he could still find his way to Solveig's side, still lay his gray head in her lap. He died on a winter morning, curled in his bed by the fire. Solveig found him already cold, a peaceful expression on his grizzled face. They buried him beside Magnus, on the hillside, where the smoke still rose each morning. Fenrir, faithful unto the end. The phrase "smoke from nowhere" entered the vocabulary of Montana Territory and spread across the American West. It came to mean any preparation that looked like madness until you needed it. Any knowledge that seemed useless until it saved your life. When someone was mocked for their caution, for their stockpiles, for their underground shelters, the old-timers would shake their heads. Remember the smoke from nowhere? Remember Solveig Lindgren? The dugout became a landmark, then a legend, then a historical site. In 1978, researchers from Montana State University documented everything they found. The structure was still intact, nearly a century after it was built. The temperature inside was still 54 degrees. The techniques anticipated principles of passive solar design that would not be formally studied for another 100 years. They called it remarkable, revolutionary. They did not realize it was simply old. The old ways always come back for the same reason. Because they work. Solveig Lindgren lived to be 89 years old. She outlived her husband by 7 years, her brother by 3. She saw grandchildren grow up and great-grandchildren take their first steps. She watched automobiles replace horses and airplanes cross the sky, but some things did not change. She still rose before dawn each winter morning to tend the fire. She still taught anyone who wanted to learn. She still looked up at the hillside where she had survived that first terrible winter and felt a complicated mix of grief and gratitude and pride. On the morning of her death in the spring of 1957, she asked her granddaughter to help her outside. She wanted to see the smoke one more time. They sat together on the porch, the old woman wrapped in blankets, the young woman holding her hand. The sun was coming up over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. From the hillside, a thin thread of gray rose into the air. The dugout was still maintained, still heated in winter, still ready. The smoke still rose from nowhere. Solveig smiled. "Do you see it? That smoke? I see it, grandmother. That was me. That was your great-great-grandfather Magnus. That was everyone who came before us, everyone who learned the old ways and passed them down." She squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "It will be you too. Someday, if you remember what I taught you, if you keep the fire burning even when everyone says you do not need it." Her eyes closed. The storm always comes. But if you build right, if you learn from those who came before, you can survive it. You can even save others. Her breathing slowed. Father, mother, Magnus, Stellan, Fenrir. One last breath. I am coming. Some stories end with revenge. This one ends with something better. A young woman who was cast out, who built herself into the earth, who saved the lives of everyone who had laughed at her, not because she wanted vindication, but because that is what decent people do. The smoke still rises from that hillside in Montana, if you know where to look. The dugout still stands more than a century after a 17-year-old girl and her 15-year-old brother carved it from frozen ground with nothing but their own hands, and the knowledge passed down from their grandfather. And the lesson still applies. You can laugh at someone's preparations. You can call them crazy, call them animals, call them whatever makes you feel superior. But when the storm comes, and the storm always comes, the ones who prepared are the ones who survive. And if they are good people, they will save you too. Thank you for listening to the story of Solveig Lindgren in The Smoke from Nowhere. If it reminded you of the importance of preparation and humility, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of frontier wisdom and quiet strength. The smoke may rise from nowhere, but there is always someone keeping the fire burning. Tariti, Riyanan.